The history of the Pacific Northwest is best viewed through the twin lenses of contest and exclusion. We argue that all people of all colors face social and economic boundaries that denied them their rights and precluded them for fully participating in society as equals. So it's increasingly apparent that the coronavirus has illuminated these schisms, these existing schisms, whether it's any sort of natural disaster or catastrophe, whether it's Katrina, or in this case, COVID-19, the existing dysfunctions in society, these schisms, these unbalances are illuminated by these disasters, and that's certainly the case. People of color, in this case, people of color, African Americans, Native Americans, and Latinos are experiencing COVID-19 infections and deaths at rates far greater than their representation in the population. It's also apparent that they encounter boundaries not too different from those that they faced a century and a half ago, which is where we're going to spend most of our time tonight. My goal is to use history to help explain these phenomena. Focusing on the Pacific Northwest, what can history teach us about the racial boundaries of the pandemic? We can get a sense of what's going on now by looking at some of the headlines recently in national media. I've pulled some headlines from the New York Times, the Seattle Times, the New Yorker, and others, and we can see here what's going on, right? This top one, COVID-19's race and class warfare. It has exacerbated, the virus has exacerbated class tensions. I mean, the virus doesn't care about class, right? I mean, a social class, but class nevertheless is a major factor in who gets infected. And the question I'm going to ask you and I want to discuss tonight, why is that the case? Why are people in the lower economic classes getting infected at greater rates? The second headline, why the coronavirus is killing African Americans more than others. That's the kind of the question today. Blacks are infected at rates up to 240% greater than whites. How can we explain that? And finally, this last headline, Black-owned businesses could face hurdles in federal aid programs. Right? That multi-trillion-dollar relief bill that came down from Congress doesn't reach small business, especially those owned by minorities. And I'm asking, all right, that why is it clear that race plays a role in these benefits? Are these federal benefit programs biased in how they administer themselves? Is there a structural bias in these programs, or is there a more fundamental explanation? Some more headlines here, right? This one is kind of focusing on Latinos. We have seen a sharp rise of hate crimes related to the virus. There has been in 2019, hate crimes were at a 16-year high. We've seen a rise in hate crimes over the last 4 years, and now they've spiked again. Additionally, it's really difficult to make any real conclusions about race as it related to the virus, because we don't know who the victims are entirely. You'll see tonight that African Americans, Latino Americans, principally Native Americans, are not always counted. The states have had to dig very deeply to figure out just who are the victims of this virus. And so we're going to look for answers. Is it in the kind of work they do, right? If we look at US Latinos, they are hardest hit by pay cuts, job losses due to the coronavirus. Also, the virus is impacting minorities because they are overrepresented in nursing homes and in Black and Latino communities. This is where the damage is being done. So I also then want to look at another kind of victim, not necessarily a victim of the virus, not directly, but victims as scapegoats. It's very clear that globally, as well as in the United States, Japanese are taking the blame here. They're being scapegoated. The top headline: spit on, yelled at, attacked. Chinese Americans fear for their safety. Another conspiracy theory: Trump aide accuses China of using air travelers to seed the virus. And I was reading these headlines as I was doing my research, and I was reminded of this handbill below. This: shall we have Chinese? No, no, no. This was posted, this handbill was posted on every telegraph pole and business door in Tacoma in 1885, prior to the expulsion of the Chinese from Tacoma in that city. We're going to spend some time talking to there. So it's this idea that we've kind of seemed to, the virus is just taken us back to a long time ago. Shall we have Chinese? No, no, no. So how are we going to explain this? How can we make this work for us? And I want to share with you my mantra for teaching history. As a history professor, and I get a lot of pushback from parents and students. Why do I have to take history? I want to be a game designer. Why do I have to take history? I'm in a nursing program. I don't need history, right? Parents really discourage their children from majoring in history. But if we can make history relevant, then we can make it more acceptable. And so I share this with them. To make sense of the present and hold any hope of shaping the future, you must first understand the past. So students, they don't come to my classes very excited about the course, but they slowly warm up to it because it helps them make sense of the world. The school shootings, for example, and the struggle with the Second Amendment. What's the history there? How can we make sense of these tragedies by looking to the past? Police shootings help bring focus and make sense of organizations like the Black Lives Matter or the civil rights. If you understand the relationship between the police and African Americans, it'll help you understand the tragedy that just happened this week in Minneapolis. The past can help us make sense of the present. So this is what I preach to students, and hopefully we're going to use this tonight to better understand what's going on with this pandemic. So let's look at the history of the American West. How can we make sense of that? So let's take a quick tour. On fast forward here, we're going to look at the racial conflict of the American West, especially the Pacific Northwest. And I often like to quote Patricia Nelson Limerick in her book, The Legacy of Conquest. She's a premier Western historian, and she argues that the history of the American West was a contest for property and profit, as well as a contest for cultural dominance. So that helps us make sense of it. By the late 19th century, the region, the Pacific Northwest, including Seattle, was a cultural milieu of Native Americans, African Americans, immigrants from throughout Asia, and Latinos. In fact, the city has been highly diverse almost from the beginning. What we need to know is that they weren't welcome. White America marginalized natives from the very beginning, and people of color were not welcome. But the challenge they faced was that they were needed. There was a shortage of jobs. You know, we have a seesaw economy throughout the 19th century and early 20th century. There would be frequent recessions and then booms, this bubble and burst bubble. And so when times were good, people of color were kind of begrudgingly tolerated. You put up with it. But when the bottom falls out of a market, and some of these recessions could very deep and last for many years, then the tensions would arise. So it was economic competition. And begrudging acceptance would evolve into fear and loathing during these recessionary times. So let's take a very high level look here and see if we can, just kind of an introductory slide, see if we can make sense of this, right? I like to quote Horace Greeley, the New York Times editor. He's famous for saying, "Go west, young man, go west and grow with the country." Well, from his point of view, and from an historical point of view, the message was really, go west, young white man. The history of the Pacific Northwest is a history of discrimination and segregation, whether it's Native Americans, African Americans, Latinos, Chinese immigrants. And to help us understand it a little bit better, we look beyond racism. It was more than racism. Racism was a byproduct of racialism. Racialism was the theories that fed into racism. And it goes like this. White settlers in the Pacific Northwest brought their racial attitudes with them from the East. And most Americans viewed the world in racial terms. Consistent with attitudes and scientific beliefs of the time, they accepted white superiority as a matter of course and viewed other races as genetically inferior. This was the scientific views of the time. Racialist theories, distinct again from racists, held that God created a superior Anglo-Saxon race destined to conquer and control all others. This is the nonsense that was being spouted out. The whites were put on the planet to rule over other races. And they used history as proof. The racial inferiority was seen as a permanent condition, and there's no assimilation, there's no Mongolization there. You were inferior permanently. And non-whites grouped all non-whites, whites grouped all non-whites into four races: Indians, Mexicans, Mongoloids, and blacks. Mongoloids was the name used for people of all Asian descent. And they looked at the past to justify this so-called dominance, their long history successfully conquering native peoples, enslaving blacks, and marginalizing Mexicans. This was a natural order of things. So that's what we need to keep in mind as we think about dismantling racism. We have to understand that it was based on a pseudoscience known as racialism. Okay. We also need to be clear that people of color, especially African Americans and Chinese Americans, were used as substitute labor. I explained to my students, it's kind of like a substitute teacher. During strikes, during war, during when there was a labor shortage, people of color were able to get jobs. But again, if those conditions, when the war was over, when the strike was over, when the recession was over, there was a lot of economic competition, and people wanted their jobs back. So this is just an overview. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at, individually, we're going to look at a little bit of history of Native Americans, and then Chinese, African Americans, and Latinos. The number one story, really the predominant story of the relationship between Europeans, Euro-Americans, and Native Americans is that of the disease. The native peoples of the Americas had no immunities to European diseases like smallpox, chickenpox, influenza, the plague, and we have pandemics. You can almost look at it as a 400-year pandemic. It starts with when Christopher Columbus lands in the Caribbean, and then goes on and off for the next 400 years. There were major pandemics in South and Central America in the 16th and 17th centuries, in New England and in Eastern Canada in the 17th century, on the Pacific coast and the Great Plains in the 18th and 19th century. So my students now really relate to this. As you can imagine, it seems a lot more relevant to now. I mean, I've been giving this lecture on native disease for a decade, and boy, I get their attention now. There's really kind of understanding what's going on. These diseases came in waves. Think about of the coronavirus. We just get over this in a couple of years, and then another kind of virus comes on, and then a couple of years of that, another one would lay waste. And so this is kind of what happened in Native Americans communities. We're going to see a 50% fatality rate in 10 years, up to 90% in 50 years in affected areas. And they were repeated and diverse. So chickenpox would come in, take 10, 20% of a given population, let's say in a region or a clan or a tribe. And they'd come in and take 15, 20% and just devastate the community. And then they would no sooner kind of get back on their feet and life to return to normal, and chickenpox would come in and take another 10%. And after that, influenza would come in. These were deadly diseases with which the natives had no immunity. And so they would be very little time to recover. They just kind of get back on their feet from one infection, one epidemic, and another one would come in. And you can see here from this illustration, this is from a Spanish mission. It was probably drawn by a priest. This looks like smallpox, could be chickenpox, in the impact on the natives. And you can see here, I don't know if you can see this little bubble here, shows that the Spanish anyway were aware of how the virus infected others. Well, today we call them droplets, and from coughing and talking, and these viruses were communicated through bodily fluids, and so I think that's interesting, that the fact that this could be 300 years old, and they were aware of how these diseases were communicated. And so we're talking about a 90% kill off of native peoples over a 400-year period. Historians disagree and debate all the time just how many people there were in the Americas. We were talking about from the northern tip of Alaska to the southern tip of Chile, anywhere from 100 to 150. I've seen estimates of 175 million people in 1491, like the pre-Columbia era. But let's, to just help a poor history major do the math here, let's round it at 100 million, right? That's a 90 million people die from European diseases. And so when we can look today at the death rates of native peoples, not so much here in the Northwest yet, but if you look at the Navajo Nation down in Utah, Colorado, that area down there, this is a repeat. This is another kind of pandemic with which their peoples had suffered for centuries. So that's a look at Native Americans. Now let's look at the Chinese. It's impossible for us to overestimate the fear and loathing of the Chinese in the American West. Chinese first immigrated to the Americas in the 1850s with the California gold rush. Word of when the gold was discovered in 48, and then in 49 it really started taking hold. By 1850, word is spread all the way around the world, and people come up from all over the world, from Europe and Eastern Europe, and from the South and Central America, and from throughout Asia. And the Chinese, we see them in California in the 1850s. When the rushes were played out, they worked on the Transcontinental Railroad. And again, we have this phenomenon of this begrudging tolerance. Nobody wanted the Chinese there, but who was going to do the labor? They did the labor the white men refused to do. They did all the dangerous work on the railroads. They also did the most drudgery work. And there was this ethnic pecking order to jobs, conductors, engineers. These jobs were held by white men, and the most dangerous jobs, laying track, blowing holes in mountains, digging tunnels, were done by the Chinese. And what's interesting about the Chinese is that, first of all, they did not intend to stay in America. They weren't trying to fulfill an American dream and become part of America, an American citizen, right? They intended to return to China. They wanted to earn enough money to support their families, and they planned to go back. So that explains why they kept their traditional dress, their cues, their diet, but they were very industrious. They would carve out their own farms and start fishing operations. They would sell fruits and vegetables that were bigger and brighter and more juicy, and they'd sell them cheaper than the white farmer. They'd come back with a fishing catch where the fish were bigger and fresher, and they're selling them cheaper. And in the gold fields, they were first used as labor in the gold fields. As you can see here, this is a hydro mining facility. The environmental devastation of this kind of mining, using explosives and hydraulic technology to basically wash away a mountainside, and all the water would be run through these sloughs, and the Chinese then would screen out all the precious metals, all the gold. And then, by this time, the corporations had taken over. Most of these large digs were very expensive, and the corporations had the capital to fund these. And they would take out 80, 85, 90% of the gold, and the rest of it was not worth the expense of trying to dig it out. So the corpse would move on to the next site, and the Chinese would stay behind and work it to death, turning over every rock, every stream, and make a living. And of course, you can imagine the kind of tensions that created in town when the Chinese would come in to the survey office and want to get their gold weighed and valued. So that's the kind of the origin of the Chinese in the Americas. These were industrious people who had wanted to return to China, and they really make their presence felt. We'll see them come north in the 1880s. They'll come up to the Pacific Northwest, following the gold strikes and the jobs on the railroads. So that's just a little bit, but let's look more specifically at what happens when they come north, right? Beginning with the Chinese Expulsion Act of 1882. By the late 80s, there were many thousands of Chinese competing for jobs in the American West, as well as in the Pacific Northwest. And the legislators from the Washington Territory, as well as the state of Oregon and California, pressured Congress to pass something that would cut back, solve the Chinese problem. I'm doing that in quotes, right? Solve the Chinese problem. And so Congress passed the Chinese Expulsion Act of 1882. And it says specifically that they did this because the Chinese endangers the good order of US territories. Now, I think we could argue that Congress thinks they're solving this problem. What the act did for is that if you were Chinese and you came to the Americas after 1880, you were expelled. You were exported to China if you had been in the country less than 2 years. They also literally slammed future immigration. They literally cut it to zero, with some exceptions. I think they think this is how they're going to solve the problem. But it had the opposite effect. It really triggers vigilante and violence, as a series of them, for the next 2 years. The next 5 years, actually. And we're going to see one incident of violence after another, beginning with the Rock Springs one in Wyoming.
This is that I'm choking, that's how we get sick, okay?
In September of 1885, in the worst incident of this type, more than 150 Chinese were attacked. Up to 20 were killed in Rock Springs, Wyoming. Gangs of white miners were angered over the owner's decision to let the Chinese work the more richer areas of the mine. And what happens is that, again, the Chinese were very ambitious. They were hard workers, and they're getting paid by their dig. And the mine owners understand they want their hardest workers working the most richest part of the mine, and it really creates anger with the white miners. That night, they stormed through the town, burning homes, shooting Chinese on sight. There are a few indictments in this. There was a trial. No one's found guilty. That's in Rock Springs, Wyoming. In Tacoma, we have the expulsion of Chinese. Again, here in Tacoma, I live in Gig Harbor, grew up in Tacoma. By 1885, the Chinese were a significant portion of contributed to the local economy. They worked in domestic work. They worked in restaurants, hotels. There was a small Chinatown down on the waterfront, but they were a problem, perceived as a problem, and the city leadership wanted to do something about it. So they're acting on a prearranged signal. Committees of white men, get this, led by city officials, marched through Tacoma, rousting Chinese from their homes and businesses. The Chinese were forced to board the southbound train on a rainy November night, headed for Portland and San Francisco, and told never to come back. They spent the night waiting at the train depot. 2 died from exposure, but more than 600 Chinese were kicked out of town before federal troops stepped in and put a stop to it. Literally solved the problem of the Chinese literally overnight. And it was so efficient. I mean, this is not a bunch of drunk miners like in Wyoming and some of these other incidences where white men get drunked up and get angry and just spontaneously attack the local Chinese. This was planned. The mayor, the chief of police, the city council, the chamber of commerce organized an organized expulsion of a people by race. And it was so effective, it takes on a name. It takes on the name of the Tacoma method. You know, you think Tacoma was known for its aroma or the Toyota, right? No, it's best known for the Tacoma method. It's efficiency, the efficiency with which people were expelled from a city. In fact, you can still see remnants of this. There's a reconciliation park down on the waterfront, but also Tacoma is one of the few large cities on the West Coast that doesn't have its own Chinatown or international district. I should also note, in fairness, that the citizens were much divided over this. Not everybody favored the expulsion. It really kind of divided the city. A lot of people were horrified by it. Interestingly enough, it was just a few months later, in February of 1886, that Seattle joins in the exclusion game here. Kind of copying what Tacoma did, gun-toting rioters forced Chinese from their homes, and they were ushered at gunpoint to the waterfront, where they were loaded on a steamer bound for San Francisco. About 200 Chinese left that night, while another 150 had to wait overnight for the next boat. They kept overnight on the docks in Seattle. But by then, the police had been alerted, and city leadership got sense of itself, and police intervened. Unfortunately, a riot broke out in which shots were fired, and 5 rioters were wounded, one of which later died. So that's just a little history of here of the harsh conditions under which Chinese were dealt. I want to finish up with Hell's Canyon in 1887. Chinese are working on the Snake River, on the Oregon side of the river in Hell's Canyon. Not sure how many were there, but they've been out there for weeks. Again, as I kind of, the vein had been worked through. The large corporations took what they could afford to take and left. The Chinese come in and they're picking it clean. And really to the ire of local white men, they come in at night and murder up to 34 Chinese. Take their gold, and there's like $5,000 worth of gold there. That's an extraordinary amount for that kind of dig. And murdered them and then mutilated their bodies. And it goes undetected until body parts start floating downriver and start showing up in places like Lewiston. And so eventually there is a trial. I think only 2 or 3 men were actually indicted, and no one was found guilty. So this is the history of the Chinese and the fear and the resentment that existed here 150 years ago. And I guess we can now better understand how to make sense of the anti-Chinese sentiment we're seeing today. Now take a quick look here at African Americans. The we see the first African Americans in the American West coming out with the Army in the 1850s and 60s. They were known as Buffalo Soldiers. I ask my students, why would they call them Buffalo Soldiers? And they, of course, don't know. But the Native Americans gave them that nickname because their hair reminded them of the buffalo hide. So we see the first presence of African Americans with the Army. Later, we see settlers. These are mostly former slaves or children of slaves who are escaping the Jim Crow of the American South, coming out west because they heard that the Pacific Northwest was better for people of color, better for Negroes, I guess they would have put it. There's some debate as to whether we deserve that representation here or not. And certainly Oregon would argue that they were not, because the Oregon exclusionary law prohibited people, African Americans, from settling in Oregon at all. Oregon enters the Union as a free state. And some would argue, well, that was very progressive of them, and they were anti-slavery. Well, they might have been anti-slavery, but they were also anti-Black. And they came in as admitted as a free state as a strategy to keep African Americans out. Settlers, though, Blacks would come in, they would then be told to leave. They would have given them 30 or 60 days to leave the state, and they'd go north into Washington Territory at the time, and which was much more lenient and accepting of people of color, because up until 1846, the Pacific Washington Territory was co-managed by Great Britain as well as the United States. And Great Britain had been an anti-slave, had outlawed slavery in England decades earlier. So the African-American settlers who first go to Oregon will find a more welcome home in Washington. The most famous of that is the Black man who's 60 years old. He comes to Oregon with a whole cadre of people, a whole family, a big clan. And they would first locate in Oregon, then be sent north. And George Washington Bush in 1844 was settled in Olympia and make a name for himself there and endear himself to the local community there in Tumwater. He ran a grist mill. And again, in another example of how not everybody was racist or held racialist theories, the white business people came to the aid of the Bush family with the passage of the Land Claim Act of 1850. So the federal government's giving away land in the Pacific Northwest, and the Bushes were in danger of losing their land because they were essentially squatters. It was unclaimed land, but the local business community came to their aid, petitioned Congress, and they were able to keep their land. So, so that's just a little history of the first settlers. The majority of African Americans come to the Pacific Northwest when the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad that connected Minneapolis-St. Paul with Puget Sound. They're working as porters, baggage handlers, cooks, housekeepers. There's just a really demand for them, mainly because of George Pullman and the Pullman Palace Car Company. And I call Pullman kind of the Howard Schultz of his day. Right? Schultz turns the drinking coffee into a social experience. Right? Before Starbucks, you went to Denny's or Dunkin' Donuts, you got your coffee, you left. Starbucks, Schultz saw something different. And today you go to drink 101 different kinds of drinks. You sit there and you chill with your laptop or meet with your friends or listen to music. It's an experience. That's what Pullman did for railroad travel. The earliest railroads were not fun to ride on. They were noisy and smoky and cold. They were somewhat dangerous. And Pullman fixes that, and he creates this palace car, and he turns the railroad into an experience. Dining cars, smoking cars, sleeping cars. You can see here in this photograph of a black porter serving a drink to a white woman in her sleeping car. And so there are many thousands of African Americans working the railroads that come and eventually settle here in the Pacific Northwest. But again, they're going to be working on the railroads. If they're not working the railroads, they're working in the mines or the shipyards, and there's substitute labor, less flatteringly known as scab labor. So that's the story of the African Americans. Mexican Americans is a similar story. The earliest Mexican Americans living in California mostly, as well as in some of the southwestern states, were known as Californios. These were middle class or upper middle class Mexican citizens who owned large tracts of land. But when the United States goes to war with Mexico in 1846 and defeats them by 1848 and signs the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States purchases much of the American Southwest, all or parts of 7 states in the Southwest, and through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. And the treaty called for the citizens there, trying to protect their citizens for the free enjoyment of their property and liberty. But it didn't work out that way, as you can imagine. They were treated as outsiders from the very beginning. And we'll see exclusionary policies, anti-foreigner rules, foreign tax rules, and they're going to be marginalized. These estate owners will have settlers, white settlers would come in and squat on their land and cause all kinds of conflict. And over several decades, this once thriving middle-class Mexicans as U.S. citizens begin marginalized and pushed to the edge of society, and will eventually end up mostly in service and labor employment. So they'll come to the Pacific Northwest again with the jobs, first in ranching as vaqueros, driving cattle, then later as farm labor in World War I, substitute labor, and then in great numbers during World War II under the Bracero program, where many thousands of Mexicans and other Latinos, Mexicans from the American Southwest, were literally bussed up to Washington and Oregon during the war and work the fields. And the treaty called for them to go back to Mexico once the war was over, but it didn't work that way. Most of them stayed. So that's just an overview of history of the Pacific Northwest. It's kind of the racial past, if you will. And I'm arguing that William Faulkner had it right. That the past is never dead, it's not even past. That, it's in many ways, it's kind of deja vu all over again. We're seeing a repeat of the kinds of discrimination and segregation that we saw 150 years ago. No, we're not lynching African Americans from trees. We're not mutilating Chinese bodies and throwing them in the river, but there is enough hate crime and violence and discrimination that suggests that, yeah, we might have improved, things may be better, but they're far from perfect. And we're going to look at that. We're going to use the coronavirus as evidence that the racial disparities in America have not disappeared, and in some cases could be even worse. I'm going to share a few graphs with you. Hopefully, like my students, you won't roll your eyes and pick up your phone when I start showing graphs, but they're very relieving. These count COVID-19 deaths per 100,000 people through May 19th. And we can see here all states, you can see here that African Americans or blacks are experiencing deaths at 2.5 times the rate of most other races, whether it's white, Latino, Asian, or indigenous. Now, you don't see a number here for the indigenous peoples because we don't have an accurate number. We can't make any conclusions. Only 39 of the 50 states count indigenous people or track their infection rate. There's a lot of caveats with some of this data. Several states lump their people of color into other categories and don't differentiate. And so, it raises the question, there's a message there, isn't there? That what does it say about a society that doesn't count or categorize or catalog the death of some of its citizens? So that's deaths per 100,000 people for all states. But then I want to kind of look around the country a little bit. I'm not going to bore you with all 50 states. I picked out a couple here in the American South. Look at Mississippi. Right? The rate of infection, as you can imagine, of African Americans is much greater than that of any other races. Notice also that Mississippi catalogs deaths of indigenous peoples, while Georgia does not. It's not that there's no deaths of native people in Georgia, it's that they don't know because they're not tracking it. So that gives you a look. In the South, it looks similarly to in the Midwest. I'm looking at Illinois and Michigan. You can see how African Americans are well overrepresented in their population. In terms of we're counting deaths per 100,000 people. Notice that they don't count indigenous people at all. Here, we basically, most of these are in Chicago, in Illinois. In Michigan, it's Detroit and cities like Flint. But you notice they do count indigenous people. So again, here the pattern's the same. Inconsistent data on natives, and then disproportionate data on African Americans. Why is that? How do we explain that? Interesting enough, I was a little surprised to see this data. By and large, Washington has not demonstrated these disparities in deaths. There are some differences. I don't know if they're statistically meaningful. The rate of death between blacks and white people, there's a slight difference, not great. There have been indigenous, hard to count. It's not that Washington is not counting Native Americans. They are. There's been 195 cases in Washington, I think, through May 25. 195 infections among indigenous people and 1 death. That's the 1 death. California's had a much higher level. You can also see the overrepresentation of blacks. Latinos, again, kind of equal to white in California so far, but we can look more closely. This shows the percentage of COVID-19 cases by race compared to the 2019 county population. So this is relative to their population. This is the infection cases by race as measured against the population. And this is in King County. And we'll see here that whites are by and large slightly underrepresented. Blacks are slightly overrepresented. Asians are underrepresented. But look at Latinos. almost over 200%, far overrepresented just in King County alone. Latinos are getting it really hard in the Yakima County. You can see here they lead in terms of the number of cases and as a percent and overrepresented in the population. And this is fruit packing, it's meat packing. There are number of plants throughout the Kennewick, Pasco, Yakima, throughout that Benton County, Yakima County. We're seeing what one historian called clusters of infection in these factory settings where people are working shoulder to shoulder without protection. So that's just a quick overview of the circumstances, the conditions of people of color around the country due to the coronavirus. And I think it's really clear that the virus seems to gravitate towards people of color. But how do we explain that? How can we make sense of that? And we can do it here by looking at things a little differently. To explain what's going on. And so we know that African Americans, for example, or people in low income, people living in poverty, experience disease at a greater rate, whether it's heart disease or diabetes. These diseases are much more prevalent among African Americans. And so we can look at that as a medical diagnosis, right? As a percentage of their population, African Americans experience more disease. It's a medical, like heart disease, cancer, these kinds of things. We can look at disease and death from a medical point of view. Or you can look at more causal effect, the actual behaviors, like smoking. He died from lung cancer because he smoked all his life, or he was an alcoholic, or he ate too much and was obese and he was a diabetic, right? We're seeing a prevalence of that. So we, rather than looking at it from a medical point of view, we're looking at a behavioral point of view. But what Scott Frank, who from the Western Reserve University School of Medicine, he says, what really, if we get to the root of things, if we try to really make sense of this, it's really about poverty. And the cause of disease is inequality. Not medicine, not behavior, but the circumstances under which they live. I think the Center for American Progress summed it up very well, that African American families have a fraction of the wealth of white families, leaving them more economically insecure and with far fewer opportunities for economic mobility. So that's the kind of the price of poverty. But if we open up our mind and look at disease from these various point of views, then things start to make sense. So again, we've argued that natural disasters tend to reinforce these existing schisms. And we know that low-income workers, one, they're living paycheck to paycheck. I think I read 40% of people can't afford to pay their bills. They worry about them all the time. They're working in jobs with face-to-face interactions, again, like factories, meat plants. In Southwest Washington, it's fruit packing. Right? They're working in these kind of crowded factory-like settings. Also, they're working in service settings, in service of restaurants and hotels. The low-income people working in minimum wage jobs are more likely to get laid off, and we've certainly seen a lot of that in the service industry in the last 2 months. And the problem is they can't afford to stay home. They have little or no sick time. They have many to have no health insurance. I mean, I feel kind of guilty. My family and I, we've been writing out the stay-at-home order. I continue to teach. We're offering, Tacoma Community College is offering online classes. I could afford to go to the store and stock up on groceries. I've got health insurance if I should get sick. But people of low-income workers do not. And from George Mason University, Jepsen Guest wrote, self-isolation is an economic luxury for a few. And you can see here, these people now, they're basically being forced to work and these people have personal protection in this meat processing plant. You see the conditions under where they're working, and it looks risky even when they've got personal protection gear on. So let me wind this up. The series that Rainier Valley Historical Society has done is excellent, dismantling racism. But I guess I would argue that maybe it's not the right question, really. Is it really more about dismantling income inequality? Does racism and the hardships faced by people of color a byproduct of income inequality? I think we can argue that. If we address income inequality, will that help alleviate some of these racial tensions? I think that's fair to argue as well. And I'd like to close with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. And this was 70 years ago. He said this: "The time has come for us to civilize ourselves by the total, direct, and immediate abolition of poverty." So there you go. If you like that kind of history and you want to read more about it, I will share here with a shameless promotion of my book, Contested Boundaries, A New Pacific Northwest History. It's available wherever books are sold. And then the video, it's a 1 hour and 15-minute documentary titled Labor Wars of the Northwest, the struggle to define the region. And we've got a lot about race in there, looking at the experience of African-American workers and Chinese. And that's available here at laborwarsnw.com. So thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed that. I'm now going to turn the meeting over to Virginia.
Thank you for your informative and interesting talk. I think probably for the Q&A, the easiest way to do this is if you do have a question or something to say, unmute your video and hold your hand out, or hold your hand up, and I will unmute you and then you can say something. Rose? Okay, Carlos?
Oh, what were the economic effects of the 1918 pandemic? I haven't really heard many people talk about that or read anything about it. I'm just curious if you knew.
Carlos, one of my students. I love it when my students show up. Thank you, Carlos. Well, the economic impact was devastating, and we're talking many millions of deaths in the United States. What's interesting about it is that it doesn't get a lot of play in the press. President Wilson never mentioned it publicly. I paid it no attention at all. President Trump has been criticized for playing golf the other day. Well, Wilson played golf almost every week, and during the pandemic, and so there wasn't a lot of social distancing going in place. So I don't know if the economic impact was as steep, but it was certainly widespread.
So Cindy made a really interesting comment in the chat. Cindy, would you be willing to talk about that a little bit? You're unmuted. Cindy? Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I was just about to put on my headset and try to speak.
Mhm.
So the first portion.
I can hear her now.
Can or cannot?
We can hear you, but you're very soft.
Virginia, you might just paraphrase. If she wrote it down in the chat, you might paraphrase it for us.
Okay, I'll read it. So she says, economic
Is this
disparity.
better? Is this
Yes.
better? Can you hear me?
Much better.
Okay, so the first communication is going to be followed by the second communication. So a couple of things about Africans, Americans who are the descendants of enslaved. Our experience in America is different from our brothers and sisters from the African continent. So our Ethiopian brothers and sisters fought back Italians from colonization. Their behavior in the United States is comparable to Asian Americans. There's a nuclear family where the husband or the male heads the household. There is very little intermarrying with other cultures. There is a high value on generational grandparents, great-grandparents, aunts and uncles, almost like a tribe or a clan. The children born into those families are united by language. Most of my brothers and sisters from Ethiopia speak Amharic. Even in the 1980s, when large groups of Ethiopians were allowed into the city of Seattle because of the war with Eritrea and also the famine that was rampant in Ethiopia. Our brothers and sisters were treated different by Caucasians in Pacific Northwest than their enslaved history brothers and sisters. What I attempted to articulate in the first communication is class has more impact on the African American experience than our enslaved ancestry. And I cite my own particular situation. We do not generally take on a lot of the diet and lack of exercise when obesity and diabetes are factored in, and that is any population.
Okay,
You'll see
Cindy,
the same outcomes.
if I can, I appreciate hearing of those distinctions. Those are interesting observations. Can you share anything with us on how it's played out during the pandemic of the Ethiopian communities?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Because of the cohesion that comes with language, unity, and ancestral name. That is the distinction. African Americans took on the name of their colonizers. There were many different tribes that were brought from the continent through the Middle Passage and other ways to get to the US, whereby your link, your identity, your ability to communicate covertly, secretly, your ability to pull resources has a lot to do with your identity.
So, okay. So
I'll just say one other step and then I'll get off of that topic. When you have a woman like me who is fair-skinned and my sister who is as dark as, well, any color of ebony, and also my sister who might look like you with green eyes, it is hard to make a distinction that that is my sister. So what you have in the United States for Africans who have enslaved ancestors, it's hard for us to connect because we don't share a common name that comes from the continent, we do not share language, and we do not look like each other.
Okay.
Within the African American experience, you have color hues as light as the moderator and as dark as you can imagine. That is different from any other group in America.
Okay, I accept
That's why we have some of the challenges we do
Okay,
in
so
cohesion.
I accept the differences here. I think I understand that. I guess what I'm asking is how has that played out in the pandemic? And is the rate of infection or deaths? So that's kind of what I was
specifically the ability to have a home, or two or three.
Okay.
You don't have to be on top of each other that are living in such a small space. So what is happening and what's devastating African Americans is homelessness. And when you do have African Americans living together, domiciled together, you are generally going to find a much tighter concentration or density. So if someone gets sick, then others get sick. If someone goes to assisted living or a nursing facility, you're generally going to see the lack of resources to be able to help or transition that family member out of that assisted living scenario and back into the home where they can be cared for by children and grandchildren. I would say that it is definitely the breakdown of the nuclear family.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that. Virginia?
Anyone else have a question or a comment? I don't see anyone indicating that they do. Oh, Judith? I'll unmute you.
I just put one in the chat. It's a very minor point.
Yeah, let me read it to everyone. You mentioned the meat processing plants and other food processing. I think you said southwestern Washington. I think you meant southeastern Washington.
Yeah, thank you for that, for the geography adjustment there. Yes.
I think you're thinking of
or South
Yakima.
Central, thank you.
I think you're thinking of Yakima County, probably Franklin County, and the area around the Tri-Cities, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Kennewick, Pasco, Yakima, Wauhula County, or Wauhula, Walla Walla County, Benton County. That whole area there is a high percentage of people of Latino descent working in service industries or in meat packing and fruit packing industries.
Yeah.
Spread
Very
out.
bad, very badly hit.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for straightening that out. Anyone else have any questions or comments?
I would like to elaborate on my comment in the chat box.
Mm-hmm.
When I was talking about racial battle fatigue and the negative consequences that people of color have for their health as a consequence of living in a white supremacist society like the United States, I think as far as the pandemic goes, I certainly, compromised now because of some very, very, I would say, just very challenging experiences of white supremacy here in the United States. And as a result of that, I cannot shop for myself. I cannot do anything really. And I have to be now beholden to friends who shop for me and do a range of things for me. And I'm pretty sure that if I were not as fortunate as I am in terms of being able to work online, teach online, and so on, I would be very vulnerable, and perhaps I would be a statistic. So I think it's also important for us to recognize how the pre-existing conditions that make people even more susceptible to dying from the virus are not just economic. They're not just related to lack of resources and so on. They are also related, I think, very closely tied to the experiences of people of color under white supremacy in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And if anyone is interested in reading more about this, the person who coined the term and has done a bit of research on this, or at least a lot of research on this, is William Smith.
Mm-hmm.
And the term is racial battle fatigue. It's been linked to a range of health consequences, including diabetes, high blood pressure, cancer, and I cannot recall what else, but also including a predisposition to unhealthy behaviors, unhealthy eating, all of that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, racial fatigue, battle fatigue. I like that that metaphor. I'll look that up. Thank you. It's an interesting observation. Any other questions? I'll stay here all night. Answer any questions you have.
Anyone?
Hey, Dave, this is Dwight.
Hi, Dwight.
Hey, I may have misunderstood, but somewhere in your comments, you made a comment about, I thought it was Washington State being co-managed by the British. Or what was that comment you said?
No, you understood it right. So England and the United States basically tussled over for control of the Pacific Northwest throughout the late 19th and early, throughout the late 18th and early 19th century. So the trading companies from both are trying to control the resources, the fur trade, lumber, salmon. Both countries had trading operations here in the Northwest. It was Oregon Territory. In 1818, they agreed to disagree and set up a kind of a joint operation and said, all right, we'll kind of manage this together and just to kind of cut down on violence and conflict and to focus on business, on trade. And then that was then settled in 1846 with the Treaty of England. That's when the United States then took full control of the Pacific Northwest, or what was called Oregon Country. And that's when we set up the international border at the 49th parallel, which is the longest contiguous border on the planet. And why all of us now are rooting for the Mariners and the Seahawks and not singing "God Save the Queen." And so it was an impact. It impacted African American settlers because once they crossed from Oregon, where they were not welcome and excluded by law, they came into Washington Territory. And they were in an area that had just been more influenced by the more progressive racial policies of England. Is that clarified?
Yeah, I didn't know there was actually a whatever you want to call it, a legal document that when you referenced co-managed. That's the part that kind of threw me.
Yeah, that's it was a joint operating agreement.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. What else we got? Come on, you guys on a roll here. Anyone of my students out there? Come on, ask a question. Carlos, you still with us? All right. I think we've exhausted everybody, Virginia.
That's okay. Well, I think we will conclude. Thank you, everyone, for listening and for participating. We will be doing more of these events. We'll be announcing the timing and themes on Rainier Valley Historical Society's Facebook page and other social media, and in the newsletter and on the website. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.